I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the remnants of forgotten lives, stories left behind in the dust and decay. So, when I heard about the old Stonebridge Hotel on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to explore it. The hotel had been closed for decades, its grand facade slowly crumbling under the weight of time. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted. But I never put much stock in ghost stories. I arrived at the hotel on a dreary, overcast afternoon. The building loomed before me, its once majestic exterior marred by years of neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the front doors hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the place pressing down on me, but curiosity won out. I stepped through the doors, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Inside, the lobby was a shadow of its former self. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and rot. I could barely make out the faded grandeur of the decor, the remnants of a chandelier, tattered drapes, and a reception desk covered in cobwebs. I snapped a few photos, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. As I ventured further into the hotel, I felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the distant creak of settling wood. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that it was just an old building, but the hairs on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. I made my way down a long corridor, the dim light from my flashlight casting flickering shadows on the walls. The doors to the guest rooms stood open, revealing glimpses of faded wallpaper and broken furniture. I peeked into a few, finding nothing but decay and emptiness. Then, at the end of the hall, I saw it, a door that was closed. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was heavy and ornately carved, unlike the others in the hotel. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, before finally pushing it open. The hinges screamed in protest, and I stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. It was larger than the others, with a massive four-poster bed draped in tattered fabric. An old vanity stood against one wall, its mirror cracked and fogged with age. As I moved the beam of light around the room, it fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the corner, half hidden by shadows, was a figure. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was motionless, draped in what looked like an old hotel uniform. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath me. The figure remained still, and I realized with a jolt that it was a mannequin. I laughed nervously, relief flooding through me. It was just a prop, likely left behind by the hotel staff. I approached the mannequin, curious to get a closer look. It was eerily lifelike, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed its cold surface, I heard a sound that made my heart stop, a faint whisper coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was no one there. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. As I made my way back down the corridor, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I quickened my pace, my flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. I needed to get out of there. I reached the lobby and made a beeline for the front doors, but they were closed. I pushed against them, but they wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting around the room. The shadows seemed to close in, and I could hear faint whispers all around me. I backed away from the doors, my mind racing. I needed to find another way out. I spotted a staircase leading to the upper floors and decided to try my luck there. I ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. The second floor was just as decayed as the first, but I didn't stop to look around. I moved quickly, my flashlight flickering as I searched for an open window or another exit. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold presence pressing in on me. I found a room with a broken window and hurried inside, hoping to climb out and make my way down the fire escape. But as I approached the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written on the wall, in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "You can never leave." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from the very walls. I turned to flee, but the doorway was blocked. Standing there, in the same old uniform, was the mannequin. But it wasn't motionless anymore. Its head turned slowly to face me, its glassy eyes filled with a dark, malevolent intelligence. I screamed and ran to the window, desperately trying to climb out. But the fire escape was gone, the rusty metal ladder lying twisted on the ground far below. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind with their dark, incomprehensible words. I turned back to the mannequin, but it was gone. The room was empty, save for the echoing whispers and the oppressive darkness. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and screamed, spinning around to find nothing but empty air. In my panic, I backed into the wall and sank to the floor, my flashlight flickering and finally going out. The darkness closed in and the whispers filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts. I felt the cold presence all around me, pressing in, suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The darkness receded, and I was alone in the room. The words on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I knew then that I would never leave the Stonebridge Hotel. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before me. In the end, I became just another forgotten story, another soul lost to the darkness of the old hotel. And as the years passed, the building continued to decay, its secrets buried deep within its crumbling walls. But on quiet nights, when the wind howls and the shadows dance, you can still hear the whispers of the lost, forever trapped in the haunted halls of the Stonebridge Hotel. Working as a night cleaner at the Grand Vista Hotel was not my dream job, but it paid the bills. The old hotel, with its faded elegance and creaky floors, had seen better days. Once a grand establishment, it was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to maintain its dignity amid peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. I started my shifts at 10 p.m., long after the last guests had retreated to their rooms. The hotel was almost always empty, save for a few long-term residents who kept to themselves. My job was simple: clean the hallways, mop the lobby, dust the antique furniture, and occasionally tidy up the vacant rooms. From the moment I began working there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. The hotel seemed to breathe, groan, and whisper secrets I couldn't quite hear. One night, as I was mopping the lobby, I noticed a strange figure at the far end of the hallway. It was a man, dressed in an outdated bellhop uniform, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. I blinked, and he was gone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the dim light and my overactive imagination. The following nights, I began to notice other odd occurrences. The lights in the hallways would flicker and dim whenever I passed, and I would catch glimpses of shadows moving just beyond the edge of my vision. One time, I found a room that wasn't on the hotel's layout, its door slightly ajar. Inside, it was filled with dust-covered furniture, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I entered the room, feeling a chill run down my spine. The air was colder in here, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, refusing to be illuminated by my flashlight. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. Its surface was cracked and fogged with age. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and fragmented in the cracked glass. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The door, however, was now closed. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was locked. I tried to calm myself, telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. I turned back to the mirror, hoping to find some clue as to what was happening. To my horror, the reflection showed the room as it had been in its heyday, clean, well-lit, and bustling with people. But these people were not ordinary guests. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and empty. One figure stood out among them, the bellhop I had seen before. He stepped forward, raising his hand to point directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The reflection faded, returning to the dusty, abandoned room I was trapped in. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The air grew colder, and I felt as if I were being watched by unseen eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and I bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. I raced down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. When I reached the lobby, I collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. I decided then and there to avoid that part of the hotel. A few nights later, I was cleaning the grand ballroom when I heard faint music. The room was supposed to be empty, but the soft strains of a piano echoed through the air. I followed the sound, my heart pounding. As I entered the room, I saw the grand piano in the corner, its keys moving on their own. The figure of a woman in an old-fashioned dress stood beside it, her back to me. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She simply continued to play, the haunting melody filling the room. I stepped closer, and as I did, she stopped playing. The silence was deafening. She turned to face me, her eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. I backed away, terror gripping me. The next thing I knew, I was running through the hotel, the echoes of my footsteps mingling with the whispers that now seemed to come from every direction. I could feel them closing in on me, unseen hands reaching out from the shadows. When I finally reached the lobby, I grabbed my things and fled the hotel, vowing never to return. I quit my job the next day, but the memories of that place haunted me. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of whispers in the dark corners of my mind. I tried to move on, but the Grand Vista Hotel had left its mark on me. Months later, I read in the local paper that the hotel had been condemned and was set to be demolished. I felt a sense of relief, thinking that whatever haunted that place would finally be put to rest. But on the night before the demolition, I had a nightmare. I was back in the hotel, the bellhop and the woman in the old-fashioned dress standing over me, their hollow eyes staring into my soul. When I woke up, I felt an inexplicable urge to visit the hotel one last time. I drove there in the dead of night, the building looming like a dark sentinel against the sky. The demolition crew had already set up their equipment, and the area was fenced off, but I found a way through. Inside, the hotel was eerily quiet. I made my way to the grand ballroom, the memories of the music and the woman flooding back. The piano was gone, but the air was still thick with the oppressive presence I had felt before. As I stood in the center of the room, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there they were, the bellhop and the woman, their eyes hollow and dark. They reached for me, their whispers filling my mind. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows closed in around me, and the last thing I heard was the sound of the piano, playing that haunting melody. The next morning, the demolition crew found my car outside the hotel, but I was nowhere to be found. The Grand Vista Hotel was reduced to rubble, but the whispers of those who had been lost within its walls continued to haunt the town. I had become just another ghost, another lost soul trapped in the darkness of the old hotel. And as the years passed, the townspeople spoke of the hotel in hushed tones, warning others to stay away from the cursed place where the echoes of the past could never be silenced. I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it comes to ghost stories. I pride myself on being rational, grounded in reality. So when I heard the legend of room 616 at the old Hawthorne Hotel, I shrugged it off as nonsense. The story went that anyone who stayed in that room never came out. The staff wouldn't even enter it. Yet, it intrigued me enough to want to debunk the myth personally. I arrived at the Hawthorne Hotel late one evening, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The building was imposing, with its grand, albeit fading, Victorian architecture. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist barely looking up as I approached the desk. "I'd like to check into room 616, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The receptionist's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. "I'm sorry, but that room isn't available." "I'll pay double," I insisted. "I just want to stay there for one night." She hesitated, then reluctantly handed me the key. "It's your funeral," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for me to hear. Undeterred, I took the elevator to the 6th floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The lights flickered as I walked to the end of the corridor. Room 616 stood there, its door looking no different from the others. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was surprisingly normal. A standard hotel room with a bed, a dresser, and an old television. The wallpaper was a bit dated, and the air had a slight musty odor, but there was nothing outwardly sinister about it. I set my bag down and explored the room, finding nothing unusual. As the evening wore on, I settled in with a book, the lamp by the bed casting a warm glow. Everything seemed fine until I heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind the wall. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a rat. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, like nails scraping against wood. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. It was like someone was speaking on the other side of the wall, but the words were garbled, indistinguishable. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled away. Returning to bed, I turned off the light and tried to sleep, but the room felt different now. The air seemed heavier, colder. I pulled the covers up to my chin, every creak and groan of the old building amplified in the darkness. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, coming from the direction of the closet. I sat up, my heart pounding. The closet door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and approached it. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic. I reached out and flung the door open, the light from my phone illuminating the inside. It was empty, just a small, dusty space with a few old hangers. But the whispering continued, now coming from the floor beneath the closet. I noticed a loose floorboard and pried it up, revealing a dark, narrow passageway descending into the darkness. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop, to leave the room and never look back. But my curiosity overpowered my fear. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and squeezed into the passageway, the walls pressing in on me as I descended. The passage led to a small, dimly lit chamber. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. In the center of the chamber stood an old wooden chair, and sitting in it was a figure, bound and gagged. I approached cautiously, my heart in my throat. The figure was a man, his eyes wide with terror. He was emaciated, his skin pale and clammy. I quickly removed the gag and tried to untie him. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The room," he whispered hoarsely. "It wants us. It feeds on us. You need to leave before it's too late." I barely had time to process his words when the chamber began to shake violently. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all screaming in unison. I grabbed the man and tried to drag him back up the passageway, but he was too weak to move. "Go!" he screamed. "Save yourself!" With a heavy heart, I left him behind, scrambling up the passageway as the walls seemed to close in around me. I burst out of the closet and slammed the door shut, my mind reeling. The room was now filled with an oppressive darkness, the whispering voices louder than ever. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't move. I was trapped. The whispers grew deafening, and I could feel an icy presence closing in on me. Desperation took hold, and I pounded on the walls, shouting for help. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, taking on ghastly forms. I backed into a corner, my flashlight flickering and finally going out. As the darkness enveloped me, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice that seemed to come from within my own mind. "You belong to us now." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The room seemed to collapse around me, the walls closing in until there was nothing but cold, suffocating blackness. The next morning, the hotel staff found room 616 empty, the door wide open. My belongings were still there, but I was gone. Just another victim of the cursed room. The staff quickly closed the room off, adding another layer of mystery to the legend of the Hawthorne Hotel. And so the room remains, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in, never to be seen again. The hotel stands as a silent sentinel, its secrets buried deep within its walls, and on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of those who were lost, forever trapped in the darkness of room 616. I never intended to work at the Riverwood Hotel. I needed a job, and they were hiring. Simple as that. The place had an old-world charm, nestled near the banks of a meandering river, its brick walls covered in ivy. Locals spoke of it with a mix of reverence and fear, but I brushed it off as small-town superstition. What mattered to me was the paycheck. My first few weeks were uneventful. I worked the evening shift, checking in guests and handling the occasional complaint. The hotel was usually quiet, the hallways dimly lit, the decor outdated but well kept. It wasn't until one particularly stormy night that things began to take a darker turn. It was a Friday evening, and the storm outside was raging, thunder echoing through the empty lobby. I was alone at the front desk, staring at the clock and counting the minutes until my shift ended. Around midnight, the power flickered and then went out completely. I cursed under my breath and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer. The emergency lights kicked in, casting an eerie red glow over the lobby. I called the maintenance line, but no one answered. I remembered hearing that the breaker box was in the basement, and since I couldn't leave the guests without power, I decided to go down there myself. I found the door to the basement near the kitchen. It was old and heavy, the wood splintered in places. I pushed it open, and a musty smell wafted up from below. The staircase was narrow and steep, and the flashlight's beam barely cut through the thick darkness. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the storm above faded into a distant rumble. I reached the bottom and found myself in a large open space filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. The breaker box was on the far wall, half hidden behind a pile of discarded chairs. I made my way over, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. As I fiddled with the switches, trying to restore the power, I heard a faint noise behind me. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I turned around, but the basement was empty. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and focused on the task at hand. After a few more attempts, the power came back on, and the basement was flooded with harsh, fluorescent light. I breathed a sigh of relief and started back towards the stairs. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the basement, partially obscured by shadows, was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the other doors, made of dark wood, and looked much older. Something about it seemed out of place, and despite my better judgment, I felt drawn to it. I approached the door and saw that it was slightly ajar. I hesitated, a sense of dread settling in my stomach, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room beyond was small and cramped, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty books and strange old-fashioned objects. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a large leather-bound book. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the dim light. I stepped inside and picked up the book, brushing off the thick layer of dust. The cover was adorned with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the flashlight's beam. I opened it and saw that the pages were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, all in a language I couldn't understand. As I flipped through the pages, the whispers returned, louder this time. I looked up and saw movement in the shadows at the edge of the room, shapes that seemed to shift and writhe just beyond the reach of the light. Fear gripped me, and I slammed the book shut. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I backed out of the room, the book still clutched in my hand, and hurried back to the staircase. I didn't tell anyone about what I had found. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to seem crazy. But the book haunted me. I hid it in my apartment, and every night I found myself drawn to it, unable to resist opening it and staring at the strange symbols and indecipherable text. The whispers followed me. At first, they were faint, just at the edge of my hearing, but they grew louder, more insistent. I started seeing shadows move in the corners of my vision, dark shapes that disappeared when I turned to look. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a knock at my door. I got up and opened it, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I closed the door and turned around, and that's when I saw the figure standing in my living room. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. It raised a bony hand and pointed at the book on my table. The whispers filled my mind, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. It reached out and touched the book, and the symbols on the cover began to glow with a dark, eerie light. I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest, as if something were being ripped out of me. The room spun, and I fell to the floor, darkness closing in around me. When I awoke, I was back in the basement of the hotel, the book lying open beside me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I got up and stumbled towards the stairs, my body aching and my mind reeling. I left the hotel that night and never returned. I moved to a different town, changed my name, and tried to forget what had happened. But the memories still haunt me, and I can feel the darkness lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I know now that the hotel holds secrets that should never be uncovered, and I fear that whatever I unleashed in that basement is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And I know that someday it will find me again. It started with a faint sound, something I could easily dismiss as the house settling or the wind rattling a loose shingle. I had always lived in older houses, and strange noises at night were nothing new to me. But this was different, subtle, persistent, and almost too quiet to notice at first. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was still. The kind of stillness that makes every creak and groan seem amplified. I was lying in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, trying to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise like something, or someone, moving above me in the attic. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the wind or maybe a squirrel that had somehow gotten inside. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the random, scurrying sound of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, as if something was pacing back and forth across the attic floor. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The attic had always been a place I rarely visited. It was cramped, dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. The only time I ever went up there was to store things I didn't need anymore, and even then, I never stayed longer than necessary. It wasn't that I was scared of the attic, exactly, but it had always felt off, in a way I couldn't quite explain. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But the noise continued, growing louder, more distinct. I could hear the creak of the wooden beams, the soft thud of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was someone up there? Had someone broken into the house and was hiding in the attic? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself reaching for my phone, ready to call the police. But something held me back, a nagging feeling that maybe I was overreacting. Instead, I got out of bed and grabbed the small flashlight I kept on my nightstand. I figured I'd go up and take a quick look, just to put my mind at ease. After all, it was probably nothing. Maybe a box had fallen over, or a loose beam was causing the noise. Whatever it was, I needed to see it for myself. I crept down the hallway, trying to make as little noise as possible. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft patter of my bare feet on the hardwood floor. When I reached the door to the attic, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The shuffling sound was louder now, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the attic, and there was no mistaking it for the wind or an animal. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The hinges creaked loudly, and I winced, hoping I hadn't alerted whatever, or whoever, was up there. The narrow staircase leading up to the attic was steep and shadowy, the faint light from my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. I climbed slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, listening. The shuffling had stopped, and the attic was silent, the kind of silence that feels almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. I shone the flashlight around the space, the beam cutting through the thick dust that hung in the air. The attic was just as I remembered it, cramped, cluttered, filled with old boxes and furniture draped in sheets. Everything was exactly as it should be, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I had imagined the noise, or maybe it had been something perfectly innocent, like a gust of wind. I was about to turn and head back downstairs when I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small old trunk that I didn't recognize. It was odd because I was sure I had never seen it before. The trunk was made of dark wood, the surface scratched and worn with age, and the metal fittings were tarnished and rusted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the trunk cautiously. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The floor around the trunk was scuffed, as if it had been dragged across the floor recently. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Someone had been up here, and they had moved this trunk. I knelt down and hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. The shuffling noise I had heard earlier echoed in my mind, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving the attic, locking the door behind me, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But I had come this far, and I couldn't leave without knowing what was inside. With a deep breath, I opened the trunk. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The inside of the trunk was lined with old yellowed fabric, and on top of it, nestled carefully, was a collection of photographs. They were black and white, faded with age, and as I picked one up, I realized they were all of the same person. A little girl no older than 6 or 7, with long dark hair and a solemn expression. I rifled through the photographs, my hands trembling. There were dozens of them, all of the same girl, taken in various places, inside a house, outside in a garden, standing in front of a school. The girl never smiled, never looked directly at the camera. There was something unsettling about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I reached the bottom of the pile, I found something even more disturbing, a small handwritten note, the ink smudged and the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the words sent a chill down my spine. She never left. I stared at the note, my mind racing. What did that mean? Who was this girl, and why were these photographs hidden in my attic? I felt a deep sense of unease, as if I had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. Before I could think too much about it, the shuffling noise started again, louder this time, closer. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized it was coming from directly above me, from the ceiling of the attic. I looked up, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The ceiling was low and covered in cobwebs, the wooden beams exposed and dusty. But then I saw it, a small square hatch in the ceiling, a piece of wood that looked like it could be pushed aside to reveal a crawlspace. The shuffling continued, louder now, as if something was moving around just above the hatch. I stood frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of the attic and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the hatch. And then, slowly, the hatch began to open. A pale, slender hand emerged, pushing the hatch aside with a soft creak. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, as the hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and finally, a head. It was the girl from the photographs. Her hair was long and dark, tangled and matted with dirt, and her skin was deathly pale. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and staring straight at me. She moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, pulling herself out of the crawlspace and into the attic, her feet dragging across the floor as she stood upright. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound. She just stared at me with those empty, lifeless eyes, her expression blank and unreadable. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from her. She took a step toward me, then another, her movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes and falling to the floor. The flashlight rolled out of my hand, the beam spinning wildly around the attic, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The girl was getting closer, her face inches from mine, and I could feel the cold, clammy air that surrounded her. Her eyes bored into mine, and I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was staring into the abyss itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the attic, the morning light filtering through the small, grimy window. The hatch in the ceiling was closed, the trunk was gone, and the attic was silent. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. The house felt different, colder, as if it was no longer just a house but something else entirely, something that was waiting for me. I never went back into the attic. I never told anyone what happened that night, but every now and then in the dead of night, I hear the shuffling noise again, faint but unmistakable, coming from above. And I know that she's still there, waiting, just beyond the hatch, in the darkness. It started on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set and the light in the sky took on that strange, in-between quality. I had been working late, trying to finish up a project that had been hanging over my head for weeks. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that creeps in when you've been alone too long. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the building settled. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the computer screen when something caught my eye. A flicker of movement, just outside the edge of my vision. I turned my head and looked out the window across from my desk, the one that faced the building next door. That's when I saw him. My neighbor was standing at his window, directly across from mine, just a few feet away. He was staring straight at me, his face illuminated by the dim light from inside his apartment. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had just happened to glance out his window at the same moment I did. But then I noticed something strange. He was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, the kind you give when you make eye contact with someone. It was a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something that made him happy in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to look away, shaking off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my stomach. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't help glancing back at the window every few minutes. Each time he was still there, still staring, still smiling. He hadn't moved an inch. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just zoning out, lost in thought, and it only seemed like he was staring at me. But as the minutes ticked by, it became harder to convince myself of that. There was something unnatural about the way he was standing, so perfectly still, his eyes never wavering from mine. I decided to close the blinds. I stood up, walked over to the window, and pulled them down, shutting out the sight of him. But even as the blinds snapped into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me from the other side. That night, I tried to forget about it. I made dinner, watched TV, did all the normal things I usually did to unwind after a long day. But the image of my neighbor, standing there, smiling at me through the window, wouldn't leave my mind. When I finally went to bed, I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep, my thoughts racing. The next morning, I was almost able to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I had been more tired than I realized. But as the day went on, I started to dread the moment when I would have to sit down at my desk again, the moment when I would have to look out that window. When evening came, I couldn't bring myself to pull up the blinds. Instead, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen. I worked in silence, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and lifted the edge of the blind, just enough to peek outside. My heart skipped a beat. He was still there. My neighbor was standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position, staring directly at me. His smile had widened, stretching his lips into a grotesque grin that bared his teeth. He looked almost inhuman, as if his face had been stretched too tight, the smile carved into his features. I jerked back from the window, my heart racing. This wasn't normal. No one stood in one place for hours, staring at someone else's window, smiling like that. I tried to tell myself that there had to be some logical explanation, but deep down I knew there wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. I kept the blinds closed, but I could feel him out there, his eyes boring into me through the thin fabric. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I say? My neighbor is staring at me? They'd think I was crazy. The next day I decided to confront him. I couldn't live like this, couldn't let this creep invade my life like this. So I waited until evening, when I knew he would be at the window, and I forced myself to look out. There he was, exactly as I had expected, still staring, still smiling. But this time, I didn't shy away. I held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I marched out of my apartment and crossed the hall, knocking on his door with more force than necessary. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I walked back to my apartment, grabbed the spare key that I had for some reason, probably left behind by the previous tenant, and went back to his door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the air stale and heavy. I hesitated at the threshold, but the silence inside was overwhelming, pressing me to move forward. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The place was eerily quiet, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was almost empty. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing that suggested someone had been living there, just bare walls and dusty floors. I moved toward the window where I had seen him standing. There was no one there. I checked the entire apartment, but it was completely deserted. The only thing I found was a single photograph lying on the floor by the window. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a picture of me, taken from the same angle as his window, staring out of my own window. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear, just like they had been the first night I saw him. I dropped the photo and backed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I ran back to my own apartment, locking the door and drawing the blinds shut as tightly as I could. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my mind was racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. The apartment had been empty. There was no way he could have been there, no way he could have been staring at me night after night. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, jumping at every sound, convinced that he was still out there, watching me. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The fear never really went away. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at the window, I imagined him standing there, his smile wide and empty. I avoided going outside, avoided the hallway where his apartment was. I was trapped in my own home, a prisoner of my own fear. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a soft tapping on the window. My heart nearly stopped. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and saw the blinds moving slightly, as if someone was brushing their fingers against them. I bolted out of bed and ran to the living room, but the tapping followed me. No matter where I went, the sound was there, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I knew what it was. I knew he was back. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. They arrived within minutes, but by then, the tapping had stopped and the apartment was silent. The officers searched the building, but they found nothing. No sign of anyone else in my apartment, no sign of my neighbor. They checked the empty apartment next door, the one where I had seen him, but it was still empty, just as it had been before. They assured me that there was nothing to worry about, that I was safe, but I knew better. The next night, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I could hear it coming from all sides, as if it was surrounding me, closing in on me. I tried to block it out, tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid of what might happen next. Slowly, I turned toward the window, and my blood ran cold. The blinds were open, and there he was, standing outside, looking in at me, his smile wider than ever, his eyes darker than the night. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, I could see other figures, their faces twisted into the same unnatural grins, their eyes locked on mine. They were all there, all staring, all smiling, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they swallowed me whole. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized the truth. I had never been alone. They had been watching me all along, waiting for the moment when I would finally see them for what they really were. Now I am one of them, trapped in the shadows, smiling out at the world through the glass, waiting watching for the next person who dares to look out their window and see what's really there. It had been a long day at work, the kind of day that drains the life out of you, leaving you exhausted and numb. By the time I got on the subway, my body felt heavy, my eyelids even heavier. I found a seat in the corner of the train car, slumped into it, and let the gentle rocking of the subway lull me into a doze. I didn't intend to fall asleep, but I guess the fatigue caught up with me. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks, the distant murmur of conversations, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, all of it blurred into a soothing white noise that pulled me under. When I woke up, it was with a start. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I was disoriented, not sure where I was or what time it was. The train was still moving, but something felt off, like the atmosphere had changed while I slept. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The train car, which had been filled with people just moments ago, or had it been hours, was now almost empty. There were a few passengers left, but they sat far apart, each one hunched over in their seats, staring blankly ahead. The usual noise, the chatter, the rustling of newspapers was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the last remnants of sleep, and looked around. The lights inside the car flickered occasionally, casting odd shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of my vision. I couldn't quite place it, but the light itself seemed different, dimmer, colder. I glanced at the digital display above the doors, the one that showed the next station. The letters were flickering, glitching in and out of focus, but I couldn't read the name. It wasn't one I recognized. The train slowed to a stop, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. I looked outside, expecting to see a familiar station, but what I saw instead sent a shiver down my spine. The platform was there, but it was wrong. The walls were covered in old, crumbling tiles, many of them cracked or missing entirely. Faded, peeling posters from decades ago hung limply on the walls, their colors washed out and the images barely recognizable. The lights on the platform were dim, flickering erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. But it wasn't just the station that was wrong, it was the people. A few figures stood on the platform, waiting to board, but they didn't look right. Their clothes were outdated, like something from a different era, and their faces were pale, almost gray, with dark, hollow eyes that stared straight ahead, unblinking. I felt a deep, primal fear settle in my gut. Something was very wrong. I wanted to get off the train, to get out of this nightmare, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped in my seat as the strange figures shuffled onto the train, their movements stiff and unnatural. They took seats around the car, but they didn't sit like normal people. They perched on the edges of the seats, their backs ramrod straight, their hands resting unnaturally still in their laps. No one spoke, no one even acknowledged my presence. It was as if I didn't exist to them. The train doors slid shut, and with a lurch, the subway began to move again. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of normalcy, but everything felt wrong. The air in the car was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The windows were dark, offering no view of the outside world, just a black void rushing past. I reached for my phone, desperate to check the time, to see if I had somehow overslept and ended up on the wrong train, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dead. No matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. The panic in my chest grew stronger, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to get off this train. The next station, whatever it was, couldn't come soon enough. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the doors, but as I did, I felt all eyes on me. The passengers, those strange, silent figures, turned their heads in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. They were watching me, their faces expressionless, their eyes dark and empty. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I backed away, returning to my seat. The moment I sat down, they turned away, resuming their vacant stares. The train continued to move, the minutes stretching into an eternity. I kept glancing at the display, but the letters and numbers flickered and glitched, offering no clue as to where I was or where I was going. I was trapped in this surreal, nightmarish journey with no way to escape. Finally, the train began to slow, and I braced myself as the doors slid open once more. The platform outside was just as decayed as the last one, but this time there were no figures waiting to board. The station was completely empty, the silence even more oppressive than before. I stood up again, determined to leave this time, to get out of this strange, twisted subway system and back to the world I knew. But as I stepped toward the door, the lights in the car flickered and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, I was completely blind, the only sound the faint hum of the train's engine and the blood pounding in my ears. Then, slowly, the lights came back on, dimmer than before, casting long, eerie shadows across the car. When I looked around, my heart skipped a beat. The passengers, the strange, silent figures were gone. The car was empty, except for me. The train sat motionless, the doors wide open, but the platform outside was no longer a subway station. It was something else entirely. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the floor covered in dirt and debris. Old, rusted machinery lay scattered around, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I stepped off the train, my feet crunching on the loose gravel. The air was cold, and a thick fog hung low to the ground, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of me. The only sound was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. I turned to look back at the train, but as soon as I did, the doors slid shut with a final, echoing hiss. The lights inside flickered one last time before going out completely, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. I was alone. The platform stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the fog, but there was no sign of an exit, no stairs, no signs, nothing to indicate where I was or how to get out. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, but no matter how far I went, the platform seemed to stretch on endlessly, the fog never lifting. The sense of dread that had been gnawing at me since I woke up on the train grew stronger with each step. And then I saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, their forms indistinct at first, but growing clearer as they approached. They were the passengers from the train, those same hollow-eyed figures with their pale gray skin and unnatural smiles. They moved toward me in perfect unison, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on me. I turned and ran, but the fog closed in around me, disorienting me, twisting the platform into a maze of endless corridors. No matter which way I turned, they were there, always just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. Finally, I stumbled into a dead end, the walls closing in on me, the fog thickening until I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The figures were there, surrounding me, their empty eyes staring into mine, their smiles wide and unnatural. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no escape. They moved closer, their eyes never leaving mine, their whispers filling the air, a low, droning hum that drowned out all other sound. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the train, the same dim, flickering lights overhead, the same quiet hum of the engine. But this time I wasn't alone. The figures were there, sitting in the seats around me, their hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. The train was moving, the world outside the windows a blur of darkness, and I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that there was no way out. The train would keep moving, the stations would keep changing, but I would never leave. I was trapped in this endless, nightmarish journey, with nothing but the empty stares of the passengers to keep me company. And as the train plunged deeper into the darkness, I realized that I had become one of them. I woke up with a start, the cold leather of the car seat sticking to my skin. My head was pounding, a dull, persistent ache that made it hard to think clearly. The first thing I noticed was the dark, heavy silence around me, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. I was in my car, the dashboard dimly lit by the soft glow of the instruments, but nothing outside the windows was visible in the darkness. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no memory of how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was leaving work late, the familiar routine of locking up the office and heading to my car. But everything after that was a blur, like a dream slipping through my fingers. I reached up and touched the side of my head, wincing as my fingers brushed over a tender spot near my temple. There was no blood, but the pain was sharp, almost electric. I tried to piece together the fragments of my memory, but nothing made sense. Why was I in the car? Where was I going? I glanced at the dashboard again, hoping for some clue. The fuel gauge was low, the needle hovering just above empty. I must have been driving for a while, but the GPS screen was blank, offering no hint of my location. I flicked on the headlights, and the beams cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense woods. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The sight of the road filled me with unease. I didn't recognize it, and there were no signs, no landmarks to tell me where I was. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly into the night, a twisting path leading who knows where. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as I tried to steady my breathing. I had to figure out what was happening, how I had ended up here, but the more I thought about it, the more my mind felt like it was spiraling out of control, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. I needed to keep moving, to find a way out of this nightmare. I put the car in gear and started driving, the tires crunching over the gravel as I pulled back onto the road. The forest closed in around me, the headlights casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. Every now and then I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, fleeting shapes that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. I told myself it was just the wind, the branches swaying in the breeze, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing mile. I kept driving, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The road twisted and turned, taking me deeper into the woods, and the sense of disorientation grew stronger. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the display was frozen, the numbers stuck at 12:03. It felt like time itself had stopped, like I was trapped in some endless loop with no way out. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a stop, and I was left in the suffocating silence of the forest, the headlights flickering and then going out completely. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. The only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear. The darkness pressed in on all sides, the trees seeming to move closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I knew I couldn't stay in the car, but the thought of stepping out into the night filled me with dread. But I had no choice. I couldn't just sit here and wait for something to happen. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, but there was no signal, the screen showing only the mocking words, "No service." I shoved it back into my pocket and took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was out there. I pushed open the car door, the creak of the hinges unnaturally loud in the stillness. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I shivered as I stepped out onto the road. The darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The gravel crunched under my shoes, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing behind me, only the empty road stretching out into the darkness. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light up ahead. My heart leapt with hope, and I quickened my pace, the light growing brighter as I approached. It was coming from a small cabin, nestled among the trees on the side of the road. The windows were dark, but the front porch was illuminated by a single flickering lantern, casting long shadows across the ground. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, something about the cabin feeling off, like it didn't belong here. But I had no other options. I needed help, needed answers. I stepped forward, my feet crunching on the gravel as I made my way to the front door. I reached out and knocked, the sound echoing through the night. There was no answer, no movement from inside. I knocked again, louder this time, but the only response was the creaking of the wind through the trees. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily, revealing a dark, empty interior. The air inside was cold, and the smell of damp wood and mildew was overpowering. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and looked around. The cabin was small, A single room with a fireplace, a table, and a few chairs. The only other door led to what I assumed was a small bedroom or storage area. I called out, but my voice sounded hollow in the empty space. There was no one here. The light from the lantern outside barely penetrated the darkness, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The unease that had been building inside me turned to full-blown panic, and I turned to leave. But then I saw it, something on the floor near the fireplace. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and the beam of my flashlight fell on a bundle of old clothes, crumpled and stained. As I crouched down to get a better look, I noticed something else. A small, faded photograph lying among the clothes. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and held it up to the light. The photograph was old, the edges yellowed and curling, but the image was clear enough. It showed a young boy standing in front of the very cabin I was in, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. And then I realized with a jolt of terror, the boy in the photograph was me. I dropped the picture, stumbling back in shock. How could that be? I didn't remember this place, didn't remember anything about this nightmarish cabin or the photograph. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped, and then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind the door to the other room. My heart raced as I turned to face it, the sound growing louder, more insistent. I backed away, my hands shaking, as the door slowly creaked open. A figure stepped out of the darkness, the same boy from the photograph, but now he was older, his face twisted with anger and pain. He stared at me with those same hollow eyes, and as he stepped closer, I saw the truth. The boy was me, or rather, what I had become. I tried to speak, to plead, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, pointing at me, his mouth moving silently as if he were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. And then the lights went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The last thing I felt was a cold hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me down into the void. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, and then there was nothing. No one ever found the car, the cabin, or me. I was lost, trapped in the shadows of a night that never ended, a forgotten memory in a place that should never have existed. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the other me is still waiting, still watching, for the next person who dares to find the path to the old cabin in the woods.